Alright guys, welcome back to the video. So in this one we're going to be talking about the difference between a hand plane finish and a sanded finish surface. And so we're going to be talking about these two tools in the context of finishing. You know, when you've got your wood, you're done building whatever it is you're building, and you want to get everything ready to apply some sort of finish to it. And so before we really dive into the comparison between these two, let's talk about the difference between the two different tools here. Because in the shop, they generally have two completely different tasks. The only area that they really overlap is in that finishing stage. So let's talk about the other stuff that they can do. A random orbit sander is a sander. It's meant for sanding surfaces and preparing for finish. It can also be used in some cases to apply finishes. So you can change out the pad on the bottom side of the sander here and put on a buffing pad or different accessories on the bottom of it, with the caveat that they all need to spin in some way, and that can help you apply a finish in a really nice way. And so on the other side, the low angle jack does have a few more uses in the shop compared to just a random orbit sander. The low angle jack can be used for preparing your stock. So if you don't have like a large jointer or you don't have a jointer at all, you can use a low angle jack to do all your jointing, and you can use it to do all your planing too, bringing your pieces of wood down to a specific thickness. The low angle jack, you can use it for that. If you do have a decent amount of machinery, like you guys may have seen in my videos, I have a jointer and a planer, you can use the low angle jack to kind of pick up some of the slack from those two machines. So for example, I have a 6-inch jointer. A lot of the time I like to work with pieces that are larger than 6 inches. So what I'll do is I'll start with the jointer and then clean up the areas that the jointer can't hit with the low angle jack. Then I can pass it through my planer and I still get a nice perfectly flat board. So that's a really good way of working and one of the benefits of a low angle jack. And so some of the other things that a low angle jack is good for is joinery. So you can use it to clean up, say you're doing like a breadboard end on the top, you can use the low angle jack to really clean up all of the tenons on those breadboard ends. And that makes it's a really good way of working because of the long body and sole of this tool here. So next up, let's talk about the different options you have for each tool and kind of different configurations. So with a random orbit sander, you generally have two different options for the setup of the sander. You can have a hard pad, which is what I've got on here, or you can have a soft pad. The hard pad will maintain a flat surface a little bit better, whereas the soft pad will kind of conform to a surface, like the palm of my hand. It will dip down and sand all the areas inside that non-flat surface. So having a hard pad like I've got installed on here is a great thing if you're doing things like panel sanding or you're doing any of your finish sanding on your components because you want them to stay flat. But if you're sanding things like contours or like a chair seat, that would be a really great place to put on the soft pad and then go and be able to sand all those contours. Then, of course, with those two different pads, you have all your different levels of sandpaper. And again, depending on which brands you go with and that, there are a ton of different options. Everything from, I think, 40 grit all the way up to 600 to 800 grit. So generally speaking, when I'm doing any sanding in the shop here, I start with 80 grit and work my way from 80 grit to 120 to 150 to 180 to then 220 grit. Those are the grits that I generally use. There is some variations in there, of course, but those are the most common ones. And so the nice thing about a random orbit sander is that you can change out those grits to be whatever you need them to be for whatever you're trying to do. If you're trying to get a piece of wood really smooth, you can go all the way up to 220 grit. If you're just trying to clean up some milling marks, your planer is leaving some drag marks and all that on a piece of wood, you can clean that up with some 80 grit really quickly. So that's the main setup of a random orbit sander. On the other side with the low angle jack, you can see here that I've got 3 separate blades. All of them have very different uses. And so the first one here is a 25-degree blade. A 25-degree low angle jack blade is meant for you're doing a lot of your rough work. So if you want to remove a lot of material really quickly, you're going to go for a 25-degree blade. And so the reason you go out and work with a 25-degree blade for your bulk stock removal is because it has the least resistance. Again, I don't know all the technicalities of the specific blade angles. I just know that these are the ones that specifically have worked for me. And so the next in line is a 40-degree blade. If you buy it from Lee Valley, it's labeled as a 38-degree blade, but when I sharpen it, I just sharpen it to a 40-degree blade because I find that works a little bit better and is easier to set up and continuously sharpen to that angle. So the 40-degree blade is kind of your middle ground. So if you're trying to move a decent amount of material, but you also want to reduce tear out as much as possible, because that's the thing that we're going to cover in a little bit here. But a low angle jack or any metal cutting tool does have a much higher chance of tear out compared to a random orbit sander. So the 40-degree blade helps reduce some of that tear out while also making it easy enough to remove a decent amount of material. If you're working with really curly grain, you're going to want to get all the way up to a 50-degree blade in the low angle jack. A 50-degree blade is specifically meant for, really curly grain, really complex grain. And in general, the 50-degree blade is going to be much harder to push through the wood, but it's going to leave the best possible result. And so that's one of the biggest tricks with a low angle jack, is knowing which blade you need to have in there when you're working. Again, going back to the initial examples, if I'm taking stuff off the jointer and I'm trying to get a nice flat surface, I'll use the 25-degree blade to clear off that surface and make sure it's flat all the way across. Then if I'm trying to fit up drawers into a specific space, I'll generally use a 40-degree blade because I still want to remove a decent amount of material, but I also want to have a fairly nice finish on there. And so then if I'm going to be doing something that's going to be visible in the final project, like a tabletop or side panels or anything like that, I'll generally go to a 50-degree blade because I know that that is going to give the best finish quality, and it's going to it's going to have the least chance of tearing out. And so that's the setup for both of these. Now let's talk about tear out. Again, I mentioned it a lot, specifically with the low angle jack here, because that is one of the biggest differences between these two tools. A random orbit sander, depending on what grits you use, if you get down to like 36 grit or 40 grit discs, they may tear out slightly, but not nearly as much as a low angle jack will. A low angle jack will pretty much always leave some tear out behind, depending on the complexity of your wood. If you're working with really clean, straight grain wood, you're not going to get any tear out. But as soon as you have knots or curl to the wood or any kind of crazy grain structure, you're going to start getting a lot of tear out. I've had pieces where even with the 50-degree blade installed, even with a razor sharp edge on it, I still get crazy amounts of tear out. And so the last project where I built some drawers for my desk, there was a lot of tear out on those side pieces because I ended up choosing pieces that had really chaotic grain. So even with the 50-degree blade in there, I was getting tons of tear out, especially around the knot areas. Whereas again, one of the major benefits of a sander is that it doesn't give you any kind of tear out. And the reason for this is because the cutting edges on the sander are very small little abrasive pieces compared to a solid straight blade hitting the wood. So passing this over the wood is a lot different than passing a solid steel blade over it. And so if you're really concerned about tear out on your pieces, you're going to want to go to the random orbit sander for your finishing stages. And this goes all the way back to your milling stages, and the machinery that you're using in your shop. If you're working with, really curly maple or white oak or walnut, any of these woods that end up getting a lot of curl and figure to them, you're generally going to want to use a drum sander to thickness those pieces rather than a planer, because a planer, especially a straight knife planer, is going to leave a lot more tear out. Whereas again, drum sander, sanding that surface is going to leave a much better finish. It's going to leave a much smoother finish and has basically no chance of tear out when you sand it. So as far as finishing goes on complex grains, I always am going to give it to the random orbit sander. And so realistically, this all comes down to experience. I only have about 2 years of experience using this low angle jack over a pretty wide variety of woods and projects. And overall, the low angle jack has served me well, but it always seems to leave tear out even when I'm using a super sharp 50-degree blade. Whereas again, I've never gotten any kind of tear out on the random orbit sander. But that doesn't mean that the random orbit sander is perfect in every situation. One of the biggest downsides to a random orbit sander is that it takes a long time to remove material unless you're using really aggressive grits. And so one of the things you'll notice as you start to work with harder hardwoods, your white oaks, maple, even hickory, those woods are much harder to sand rather than cutting with a hand plane. So you're going to go through a lot more of your sanding disc. You're going to have to work with harder grits. You're even going down to 60 or 40 grit sanding discs to really make any difference on those extremely hard hardwoods. Whereas a hand plane basically treats all the woods the same. Again, you will notice a slight difference between something like hard maple and cherry. There is a minor difference between the cutting actions of your hand plane, but realistically there is not that much of it. There's not a significant enough difference between the cutting actions there. And the blades don't really get that much duller. As long as you're taking reasonable sized cuts, you're not going to notice a difference between like hard maple and cherry. So that is one nice part of the hand plane. And so while we're talking about downsides of random orbit sander, you have the random orbital function of the sander itself. And so what the random orbital part of the sander means is that this bottom pad is spinning, but there's also random movements to it. So not only is this pad spinning in a circle like that, it is also moving around in a larger circle within that area. So it can be a little bit confusing, but as soon as you start to mess around with one of these things, you can get a pretty good understanding of what it all means. But one of the downsides to this is that, especially on your lower grits, so 80, 60, even 120 grit, you're going to be leaving all these little pigtail swirls all throughout your piece. And so you really have to work all the way up to 180 grit or 220 grit to get rid of those marks. And so these swirl marks become really noticeable when you apply something like stain to wood. Now, I don't generally stain wood, but if you're someone that decides that you want to stain a piece of wood to fit a specific project, those swirl marks are going to be extremely noticeable if you don't get them all out. So again, it's very important to make sure that you go through the grits properly. If you're planning on staining a piece or using some kind of coloring, dye, anything like that, you're going to want to make sure that you start at 80 grit and go all the way through the line in as small steps as possible. This is going to make sure that you eliminate as many of those little swirl marks as possible. So if you decide to go from 80 grit right up to 220 grit, you're going to get tons of little massive swirls showing up in your piece. And again, that's where the low angle jack comes in. One of the tricks with a low angle jack is when you're sharpening the blade, you can camber the edges, which means you're just rounding over the corners to make sure that those points are not cutting into the wood. And so then what happens is when you pass the blade over a specific area of the wood, and then you do another pass going about halfway over that line, you end up leaving basically no marks. And so with the low angle jack, you don't have to worry about leaving marks behind that'll show up when you finish or stain the piece of wood. So again, there are major benefits to using a low angle jack. Now, realistically, before most people get serious into woodworking, they'll either own or have used a random orbital sander. Because again, you can pick up one of these things at Home Depot for, $50. Now, the one that I have here was about $100 off of Amazon, and it's the Bosch, whatever, I don't know what the actual model number is, but it's a pretty decent sander for what it is. Now, random orbital sanders can go all the way up to a few $1,000s, whereas the low angle jack that I've got here, which is pretty much the highest level possible you can get, which is a Veritas low angle jack with PMV11 blades, it will generally run you around $400. I think this whole setup here with the extra blades is right around $400, $500, something like that. So again, much, much cheaper to get into the high end of this. But on the flip side, if you're just starting out and you just need a tool for finishing, a random orbital sander is much easier to get. And so it all depends on what stage you're at with your level of woodworking. If you're just getting started, you're going to want to go out and one of the first things you're going to need is a random orbit sander so that you can actually get some finish on your pieces and they look pretty good. But eventually throughout your woodworking, especially if you're getting into that fine woodworking area, you're going to need a low angle jack because you need one of these tools in your shop for doing precise fit-ups, for working with joinery, for just generally hand tool purposes. And again, these things are just kind of fun to work with. And so realistically, the big difference between these two tools is the amount of physical effort required to work both of them. So with a random orbit sander, all you need to do is stand still and hold and move the sander over a piece of wood. It's a much easier process. It doesn't take any technical skills or knowledge. So the only thing you have to be careful of is not to remove too much material from one area. If you just stand and hold the sander in one area of the piece of wood, you're going to create a little bit of a hole in it. But as long as you are a semi-conscious human being and can move that sander back and forth, you're going to be just fine. You're going to be able to remove material and get a nice smooth surface. Whereas with the low angle jack, you need a few different highly technical skills. First off, you need to be able to actually use this thing properly. So you need to have proper grip, apply proper pressure, otherwise you're going to create some issues. The other technical skills you're going to need is you need to know how to sharpen the blades because again, because you're working with a steel blade that you don't want to just throw in the garbage every time it gets dull, you need to know how to sharpen it and you need to have a whole sharpening system and the whole collection of sharpening stones to keep these things well tuned and cutting nicely. So again, that does up the price a little bit more of the low angle jack setup, but again, it's nothing compared to the $1,000 random orbit sander that with Festool or the Mercas. But again, comparing it to this $100 random orbit sander, this setup is still quite expensive. And so when you are actually using the Handplane to clean up a surface, preparing it for finishing that, it is going to take physical effort. Again, like I said, the random orbit sander, you just stand there and move stuff back and forth. Whereas with the low angle jack, you need to actually put physical effort behind the cutting edge of this to actually make sure it's cutting. So it depends again on which blade you're using and what the type of grain that you're working with. So if you have really clean straight grain and you can use the 25-degree blade, it's going to be a little bit easier. But if you're working with curly or chaotic grained wood and you're using the 50-degree blade, it's going to be much harder to actually push that hand plane through and get a nice clean surface. So again, all depends on your personality. I sometimes like to go with the low angle jack because I like to get a little bit of a workout. I like to be able to feel and get some physical manhandling of the piece of wood rather than the sander. The sander also has the downside of you need to have it hooked up to some form of dust collection and it's quite noisy to work around. So you're going to need either hearing protection or just at least minimally some headphones to put in because the sound of this thing is bloody annoying and that goes for every random orbital sander I've ever heard and ever seen. all the way up to your Festool and Merkle ones. So if you're someone that likes to just work in a shop in the evening, have a nice quiet time, then a handplane is a really good option for you. Because you can, you could be out in your garage at midnight, hand planing a piece of wood, none of your neighbors are going to complain. Whereas if you're running a shop vac or a dust collector, and you're running a random orbit sander, you might get some complaints from your neighbors because they might be able to hear that shop vac running, and it's a little bit more obnoxious. So as far as comfort and enjoyment of the finishing tasks, I don't enjoy working with a random orbit sander just because I find it very monotonous. You kind of have to stand there and just move back and forth. Whereas I find the hand plane very fun, very enjoyable to use in short spurts. And again, that's the big difference. And so if you look back at the last project where I built the desk and I built the desktop in specific, that is an area where I chose to use the random orbit sander because the low angle jack would have just taken too long to clean up all the material that needed to be cleaned up on there. It would have taken way too much physical effort and would become less enjoyable over time to use the low angle jack. So being able to just kind of tune out, put on a movie and focus on doing absolutely nothing other than moving the random orbital sander back and forth is a little bit of a better choice in that circumstance. But again, if I'm doing something like a small project, if I'm making a box, and I really want to, I really want to get in tune with it, I want to work with my hands a lot more, then the low angle jack is a better option there because I'm only doing a little bit of finishing work. And so there's also the byproduct of both of these finishing options. So the sander creates very fine dust. Again, it changes depending on which grit you're using, but generally everything from 80 grit upwards is going to be very fine dust. And so this Bosch sander comes with a 2 micron filter on the backside here, and it does have really good built-in dust collection to make sure that all the majority of the dust gets shot into this back container here. So that is one nice thing here. But if you're working with this thing for a long time, you're generally going to need some form of dust collection or dust extraction to make sure you're not getting the dust, shooting out of the sides here because you don't want to be breathing it in. Breathing in sanding dust is what gives woodworkers lung cancer and a lot of other really bad things. And you can cause a lot of health problems later on in life if you're breathing in too much sanding dust. So a few of your options are to hook up a good shop vac or dust collector to the back of your sander, or you can wear a respirator, or you can be in a well-ventilated area with a lot of air movement that will usually pull the dust away from you. But again, you need to be very careful when you're sanding to not breathe in all the dust created by all these different sanding grits. Because if you coat the inside of your lungs with all that sanding dust, you are going to cause health problems down the road. On the other side, with the hand plane, you do create a much nicer type of waste. So if you're using your hand plane properly, you should be getting nice long shavings out of the piece of wood that you're cutting, and those are very easy to clean up afterwards. You generally are not going to create a lot of dust, but there is a caveat to that. If you're working with an open grade wood like white oak, you are still creating a lot of fine dust. So you have to be very careful that you're not breathing in that fine dust. Again, unlike the random orbital sander, it's not the random orbital sander when the back end clogs up or if the dust collection area jams up, it starts spraying dust just everywhere. Whereas the hand plane, the dust comes loose from the shavings. It doesn't go airborne nearly as easily as it does with the random orbit sander. So again, even though both create very fine dust, the hand plane definitely creates less of it. And if you're working with something like cherry, maple, walnut, I generally don't get any of that really fine dust. It's only with open grain woods like white oak or ash or red oak that you'll find that you do get a little bit of dust left over. But again, there's much less dust. And so the other little caveat to that though is that there's so many little caveats to both of the points that I have for these things. With the hand plane, there's no good way to collect those shavings. So basically, if you have around your workbench or wherever you're working, you're going to start building up piles of hand plane shavings. The big risk here is that those hand plane shavings are highly flammable. So if you're leaving them out overnight, and you have like electrical wires or anything sitting on top of them or underneath them, you do have a higher risk of something bad happening. Whereas with the random orbital sander, all of the dust, if you're using either a container like this or you've got a shop vac hooked up to it, all of that dust is being neatly packaged into a bag or a container where you're safely able to handle it and put it away somewhere safe. So it really does come down to whether or not you're going to be willing to clean up the hand plane shavings to create a nice safe environment, or you prefer having something where the mess is just kind of cleaned up as you go. Because once you finish hand planing a project, you're going to have a big mess to clean up. Whereas generally, if you have a shop vac or something hooked up to your random orbital sander when you're finishing your project that way, you don't have any mess to clean up afterwards. And so the last part of this is which one of these tools do I recommend you use for your finishing processes? And again, this is going to be kind of a convoluted explanation. Because if you follow my Instagram or you've been, kind of been following what I've been doing for the past couple of years, you'll notice that my opinion has recently taken a big shift And so the machine that has changed my opinion of this is the drum sander. Again, at the same time I got that machine, I also got this pretty good quality random orbital sander, which then stepped up my ability to sand things. And so before that, I had a really old random orbital sander where the pads didn't really attach to the bottom anymore. You couldn't buy hard pads for the bottom of it, and just generally the dust collection on it wasn't very good. So I ended up leaning more towards the low angle jack because it let me keep my pieces perfectly flat. Again, one of the things I missed earlier in the video, the big benefit of a low angle jack is because it has such a long reference surface on it, it makes sure that all of your pieces when you're finishing stay perfectly flat. And so that's why initially, for the past probably close to 2 years now, I've really favored the low angle jack for a lot of my finishing work because I would use the low angle jack, get this perfectly glass smooth surface on it, and then I'd finish by hand sanding to 180 grit, and this gave me great results on a ton of pieces. And so I've only recently learned that if you can sand your work using a good quality random orbital sander and some good quality sandpaper, that is going to be much easier and give you a much better result than the low angle jack ever could. Again, I'm someone that doesn't have a ton of experience working with this tool. The master woodworkers, master carpenters out there might be able to get a much better performance out of the low angle jacks. But to me personally, and most new woodworkers out there, the random orbital sander, if you can buy a decent one, is going to give you just way better results. Because again, no matter what I've tried to do in the past, I always end up with little pieces of tear out on whatever thing I'm trying to hand plane. And that's why I think most woodworkers who are just getting into the craft should start by getting a decent quality random orbital sander. Again, this Bosch one is only $100 on Amazon, and there's a lot of different equivalent ones. The DeWalt one is not much more expensive. Milwaukee, they make a really good one. Any of your really nice name brands are going to make a good quality random orbital sander. Now, I did mention earlier in the video that every woodworker that gets into the fine woodworking sphere of woodworking is going to want and need a low angle jack. So where I would think about getting a low angle jack is before you ever consider buying a, like a Festool or a Merc a random orbital sander. Because I guarantee you're going to need a low angle jack before you're going to need a really nice random orbital sander. If you have the ability to sand a workpiece with a less expensive sander like the one I've got here, you've got that functionality in your shop. What you need, and what's really important, is you need the functionality of a low angle jack to do things like I mentioned with the jointer and the planer. The low angle jack is good for way more things than just the random orbital sander. But you do need a random orbital sander for a lot of your finishing work. Now, one of the options that I actually have found that I really like is combining the two options. So if you've got pieces that are really out of flat, or just generally have a lot of nastiness to clean up on them. Let's say your planer, you've got a cheap planer like I do, and it's leaving a lot of nicks and marks on it. It just looks horrible. The low angle jack can get you to a really good smooth stage. Then you can come in and use the random orbital sander with 180 grit on it, and that will clean up everything. So there are ways to combine the two to get the best results. But in general, I find myself now reaching more towards the random orbital sander for those finishing tasks. And so if you have any questions about using either of these two tools, let me know down in the comments, or you can contact me via email, and I'd be happy to answer those questions. So as always, guys, I hope you found this video enjoyable, and I will see you in the next one.